CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Africa's infrastructural development has been identified as central in boosting economic growth and creating jobs. And that discussion has topped the agenda here on the sidelines of the annual African Development Week in Dakar, Senegal. Experts, however, warn that the continent faces a gaping financing deficit, and Africa will need to work with development partners to fast-track its economic growth. Now, this comes just ahead of the One Belt, One Road Initiative Summit to be held in Beijing, China, where Africa is expected to feature. On this edition of Talk Africa, we engage some of Africa's leading minds in finding a solution to the infrastructural funding gap. From Dakar in Senegal, I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And now to expound more on the state of infrastructure in Africa, I have expert guests with me here. Professor Emmanuel Nadozie, he's the Executive Secretary at the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. Adi Adiyemi, he's the President, Leadership Impact Dynamics. And Bunmi Makinwa, he's the Chief Executive Officer, A Unique Communication for Leadership. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here. Professor Nadozie, let me start off with you. Could you expand for us a little bit more, though, on the state of infrastructure on the continent?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Without infrastructure, the industrialization agenda of the continent and the structural transformation agenda of the continent will not be realized. We need railroad infrastructure, we need road infrastructure, water infrastructure, and information and communication technology infrastructure, both at the country level, at the regional level. Unfortunately, if we look at energy infrastructure, for example, we see that there's still a serious gap that needs to be filled. Africa is not generating enough electrical energy to be able to really propel its industrialization potential. And so there needs to be massive investment and scaling up of investment in all sorts of infrastructure across the continent. But often the issue is not necessarily the issue of financial resources. They require other kinds of capacities that are lacking, but which we must have to tackle very, very seriously.
Adi, I'm sure you look around across the continent and you do some research on what that infrastructural deficit is. When you look at the various regions, east, south, west, what do you see?
Well, you obviously can tell that parts of the eastern region of the continent has grown in terms of their infrastructure more than other parts. There are places where, electricity is no longer a problem, mostly in the eastern part of the region. There are still part of the west, part of the region where electricity, which is essential for any kind of development or growth, is still lacking. So different regions need different level of infrastructure growth, but all together as a continent, if we are going to really grow to our full potential, we have to focus on our infrastructure and what it takes to get us there, because like Professor said, it's not only the financial resources, there are several other things that are required. There is the capacity development at every different level, including mindset, just to know that we could do it.
Bunmi, we've been talking about building Africa's infrastructure for decades now. Where exactly in your mind, where are we?
Well, let's say on the positive side, there's this realization that this problem must be overcome and can be overcome. The decisions that have been made by African heads of state and government in the last 3, 4, 5 years have been very specific. In fact, 16 transboundary projects have been agreed for speedy implementation as priority projects. Many countries realize the need for infrastructure development, and they have made what I call enormous investment along this route. So I would say there is some progress. But compared to where we should be and what we need to be ahead of the curve, we are not there at all.
Professor, let's look at the vision, though. What is the vision for Africa's infrastructure? Let's start there.
Well, as you know, the vision is encapsulated in the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa called PIDA, which is developed by the African Union, the NEPAD, and the NEPAD agency, supported by continental organizations such as the African Development Bank and others. And the vision here is to really address the critical issues of infrastructure development, looking at specific projects. Of course, it is important to mobilize financial resources to invest in infrastructure projects, but I think we are beginning to realize that the money to invest in preparing bankable projects is really a critical challenge at this point in time. Whereas money is there to invest in projects that are existing, the money is not there to invest in preparing the project. But more importantly, the capacity that is needed for project preparation and for project management and project implementation is really seriously lacking. And one of the visions of PIDA is to really address these kinds of issues. And we at the African Capacity Building Foundation takes this issue very seriously, and working together with our partners, we are really trying to address this issue of capacity for project implementation, for project preparation, project implementation, and overall infrastructure project management.
And before we come to the whole question of funding and how to fund that, the deficit and where exactly the alternative models of funding are, when you listen to a professor talking about there is potential and all of that, though, where do you think the biggest challenge is for Africa to meet its infrastructural needs?
Well, you know, the money is there. At a meeting in Rwanda recently, I think we were talking about raising funds within Africa, which we know is there, which we know could be done to achieve this. But it's got to be with the mindset too. Do we really know that we need this and that it could be done? Because some of the challenges we've talked about and we've faced is in Africa, when you have a change of government, you start a program and then you have a change of government and the next government just scrap everything and want to start all over again. And the more we do that, the more challenging it becomes for us to be able to finish deeply needed infrastructure projects. So as we start developing capacity, ACBD, they've been doing so much in terms of helping to build capacity in every level, whether it's like mindset, like I said, or finance, or just resources, just to get people up there. And there has been harmonization of laws within countries to make sure that if there is a project between two countries that we already agree has to be done, they can't change the laws in the middle of the project, so that everyone knows where they are and we can start, implement, and finish.
Bunmi, what do you think is the single biggest challenge, though, to meeting that infrastructural need for the continent?
That's a critical question. You see, you are asking a question about development itself. And what underlies that? The practical way to look at it is say, which countries in Africa have been able to have rapid development and what I call appropriate development in probably the shortest possible time. And you look at what characterizes those countries. Time and time again, when we look at those countries, we find that it is the leadership. When you have a leader who has the right vision, who has the right attitude to it, they can get all the other things to line up, whether it's money, whether it is collaboration with the people, whether it is getting community to support what's going on, whether it is getting private sector to get involved. The right leadership has made all the difference.
So give us an example, though. Which countries in Africa do you think have gotten it right, and what have they done right?
When you look at the literature today, in other words, when we study what analysts say and political discussions, the countries that are mentioned, traditionally, countries that have had development in Africa properly, countries that have stable democracies, you will mention easily Botswana, you will mention Mauritius, you know, those island countries, Cape Verde, what's the other one called, not far from here? I forgot the name. But in the last 20 years or so, what we have seen in Africa and what the literature seems to support, is that some of the countries that have had leadership with vision have made tremendous progress. Rwanda easily comes to mind as one of the countries that is mentioned. Countries that came out of war and moved ahead quickly, but unfortunately have stagnated. In this recent time, Uganda will be one of them. You know, this country where we are, Senegal, in terms of infrastructure, has made tremendous progress, any way you look at it. So these are some of the countries that I mentioned easily that have, turned the curve, so to say. Of course, South Africa has been ahead of the curve since a long while.
Right, and when you look at the priorities though, Professor, as well, what is it that African countries are prioritizing? Is it rail, is it roads, is it sea, is it energy? What is it they're prioritizing?
It's difficult to really begin to talk about prioritization and infrastructure development. But I think everybody will agree that energy and electricity is really critical at this point in time. You know, we need to light up the continent, we need to electrify the continent, and make sure that to generate enough energy to be able to propel the industrialization agenda of the continent. Having said that, I think one area that African countries have neglected to their own detriment is railroads. Because really, if you understand the importance of railroads in terms of moving large amounts of goods and people in a land area that is as immense as a continent, you would know that the industrialization agenda can only be propelled if we begin to pay attention to developing railroads. Not just because of the volumes, but also the fact that maintenance cost is nearly not as much as it is for what you have when you build roads. As I said before, all sorts of infrastructure are very important, but as you know, when resources are limited, one has to begin to prioritize. But I believe that African countries working with their partners, and we see that China is playing a key role in terms of supporting a lot of infrastructure development projects in the continent. But you have to have both the public sector and the private sector and the international community joining hands in public-private partnerships, in mobilizing domestic resources, and then building the capacity, as I mentioned before, that will help us to really build this sort of leadership that Mr. Makinwa mentioned about, the leadership that will really drive this vision, but also leadership that is accountable.
Right. I want to come to the question of funding, because you did mention earlier on in your speech, as I listened to you, that of all the trillions that is available in the global funding of infrastructure, African projects only command about 59 billion. Why?
This is just simply a reflection of the lack of bankable projects. And the reason why you don't have bankable projects is because, number one, you don't have the capacity to prepare those projects that can be funded. And also that even if you have the capacity, you may not have the funding to be able to prepare those projects. I know that there are facilities that are out there. For example, the infrastructure project preparation facility that's hosted by the African Development Bank is out there. But having that facility is one thing, and a country being able to have the capacity to develop the projects using that facility is also a different issue altogether. So the main fact that you don't have those projects, that's really why African investments are not happening at the rate they should happen in the continent.
Are we seeing less of African investments happening, or are we seeing a scaling up, or it is stopping there?
Well, the focus is on the infrastructure now. So because the focus is there, we are seeing a scaling up of investments in African infrastructure development. I mean, Professor mentioned it, China is becoming a big partner. We were talking earlier about the
One Belt, One Road initiative.
The One Belt initiative. That's China behind that. So we are really seeing a scaling up because we realize, you know what, when infrastructure is good, you create a new economy for the people. The growth of Africa right now, I mean, over 30% are under 30 years old. And so they are going to need this infrastructure as time comes, very, very soon. And if we don't do what we need to do, including create the leadership that's going to help them to prepare to move ahead, we will not be able to achieve those goals.
We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll continue with this discussion on the state of infrastructure on the continent. Do stay with us. Africa is not one story. Welcome back to Talk Africa. We're discussing the state of infrastructure on the continent. My guests are still here with me, Professor Emmanuel Nadozie, Ade Adeyemi, and Bunmi Makinwa. Professor, I want to come back to the models of funding that are available for African projects, because we hear about statistics that up until 2020, Africa needs about $100 billion for its infrastructural projects, but that Africa can only raise about $60 billion. The infrastructural deficit, what are the alternative models of funding here? Where is Africa finding the money to bridge that deficit?
Well, I think as we said right from the get-go, there is funding everywhere, whether they are in equity or in the savings that we have from African countries, the reserves that we have outside, which is quite significant. People have said that if you look at the continent as a whole, you have billions and billions of dollars that they put in reserves elsewhere, and not to mention pension funds that are available. So in other words, you've got the traditional funding mechanisms that are available through long-term loans and equity funding, but you also have other innovative and new ways of funding which can derive from public-private partnerships that can develop, where the private funding can come along to complement some public funding. But let's not forget that, as I mentioned before, the domestic sources of funding, if you look at it country by country, becomes difficult. But if you look at it from a continental standpoint, then you see that you have a huge pot of money there that could be leveraged or used to really bring about that. But I think countries with excess reserves, China being an example, and in the Middle East, that it is, if African countries can, really form partnerships with them and demonstrate that there are profitable infrastructure ventures that can be undertaken on the continent, they should be able to mobilize resources that can be invested in those infrastructure projects.
Right, Ade?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. When people trust leadership, they are willing to put their money there. Most investors want to invest so they can get a return. But when you have areas of instability in government, then they are wary about putting their money there or not. I think we have the right focus. I think the 2063 goals are in line. And out of almost 400 infrastructure projects that have gone through, the African heads of states have approved 16, the DFS 16, that is going to start working on. They have raised funds for almost, some of them, but we still have a gap. I think the gap can be filled once people see that Africa is bankable, for those for investing in. And I think we are at the point now where we can show them that we have that.
You did mention earlier, though, that Africa knows and is aware of its infrastructural deficit. Africa's leaders know and they're aware of that infrastructural deficit. But what is the challenge?
The mindset. It's really the mindset. That's where leadership comes in. I've been to countries. We just mentioned Rwanda. I was just in Rwanda, a country that went through that disaster they did 20 years ago. I couldn't believe I was in the same place that went through that. And people want to go there. There are places where United Nations will hold meetings very easily. ECA, ACBD, they will go there easily. There are countries they won't even think about going into because they are not sure of the stability of those places. So leadership plays a big part. Leadership paints a vision. Leadership creates a vision that people can see, and when they hold on to that vision, it changes the mindset that really we can do it. That's all Africa needs. Think about it. Everyone, most of the people that in European countries or even America that are doing great things, they are Africans. Why don't they want to come back home? Because they are wary of the situation with infrastructure. Utilities, sometimes when you are used to it and then you come home and you're having power for 2 hours a day, you start wondering, what is really going on, because you've not been used to that for a long time. So I think once the mindset is changed And once we have leaders who are really committed, like I think some of the leaders in Africa are right now, we are going to start seeing movement. I expect a lot of movement within the next 5–10 years, you will see.
Right, so we're going to wind up in a moment, but I want to get your views on regional integration, though, because we've been talking about how to enhance intra-Africa trade, how to grow our regional integration. But we have seen in this summit, in this conference, though, some issues playing out. How are we going to push on with our agenda of regional integration when it's looking, for the most part, that there are issues that we still very much disagree on?
Well, first of all, let me qualify some of the things we have been saying. See, when we talk about Africa, we almost give the impression that we're talking about one country. And I've seen places where that monolithic approach to Africa dominates, and it's confusing because variations between countries are enormous. And some of the problems that we see as huge problems for Africa, so to say, are not problems for some countries. In fact, they are well ahead of these kind of problems, whether it be power or whether it even be roads. They have made huge progress. They may have a little bit more to do, but they have done very well. Now, regional integration, in this sense also, it's not a monolithic approach. In fact, when you look at the various regions, if you take West Africa, Southern Africa, East, Central, and so on, wide differences. I mean, look at West Africa, where for the past, I don't know, almost 30 years now, you can travel with one passport of your country to 16 countries, 15 countries later on, without having to take visa for anything. Yet you have some other regions where to go from one country to the neighboring country, you needed to get a visa. So you could almost set up business in 15 countries without having to go through any difficult processes. So it is difficult to say one way fits all. But having said that, regional integration is important for the development of this continent. We have comparative advantages. And if you look at what happens in this continent, there's almost, so to say, unofficial regional integration. People travel across borders, they trade with each other, they have relatives across borders, they move according to economic, and even when you have problems, they just mass move from one country to the next until people begin to, put the walls in place. And then you realize that people who are moving in are not, the people of that country. So we have a lot of interaction that you could call regional integration. But what we are asking for and what you are looking for is a more structured regional integration. There's been a lot of discussion on that. I know that Professor Naduzie worked a lot on this subject when he was with ECA. And, little progress is made, and sometimes there's a jump forward, not as fast as we want, because the kind of integration that we should have ultimately will be an Africa-wide integration, the kind of one passport to travel everywhere, borderless Africa. It may be too much to ask for, but that's the aim, and that's where we should be going.
Right, Professor?
Well, I think I can understand that if one feels that Africa has not really achieved what it ought to achieve in this area. One of the challenges is that there has been the tendency to look at regional integration as an event that will happen when it is a process. And usually when you put the most difficult dimension of it first, then that will delay you until you realize it's impossible. And this is why when people talk about United States of Africa, which is very, very desirable and which everybody would like to see, but if you look at the process of integration, you see that that is something that will probably come at a much later date, not at the beginning, because it's not easy to force. You have to force down to close down the idiosyncrasies of independent nation states and force their leaders to relinquish their power to become either ministers or become nothing. So political integration, very, very difficult. But when you talk about economic integration, it's a process of where you start from free trade areas, free movement of people, customs union, monetary zones, before you start to go into the larger areas. And as Bumi also mentioned, you see that, you look at the continent, the different regions, you see that there is differences in terms of how far they have gone in promoting or accelerating integration in those sub-regions. East Africa is way ahead of everybody else. And I'd like to think that West Africa is not too far behind, especially in some specific things. But just like many other things that we have indicated, the reason why you have the example that was demonstrated here, in other words, that when you see the West African zone, everybody drives on the right-hand side, whereas the British colonies we used to drive on the left-hand side, was that there was leadership that was willing to sacrifice. You see, to say, listen, we can forgo some of our national pride and our heritage and join the others, and change our way. So it's a costly business, but somebody will be willing to absorb the cost. And that's where leadership comes into the picture, that we decide that we have ECOWAS passport, which means that you swallow your own sovereign issues and say, instead of having one country passport, let's have a common passport for the region. So the same thing has to happen. We need the sort of leaders that emerged in the 2000s, who were passionate about this regional integration and were willing to really bite the bullet and sacrifice and pay the cost. I think a country like Nigeria ought to be able to really drive the regional integration agenda in West Africa and be willing to absorb some of the costs that will be involved in that, so that we have a far more integrated region to really promote foreign investment, promote economic development, and promote social welfare of everybody.
Adi Adeyemi, you have the final word on this, coming from West Africa.
Well, and you know what? I totally agree. I think Nigeria is heading in the right direction. I think once they finish working on corruption, which seems to be what we have to get right first, then the resources is going to be there to be able to do what has to be done in Africa as a whole. Nigeria can take a lead because of the population, the wealth, and the resources that it has. One thing our professor didn't say to you is that we're talking about integration. The AU actually have a passport that very few people only have. I don't, he doesn't, but he have that passport right now that he can go anywhere within Africa without a visa. With some leadership, we can get there, because once you are able to do that, I mean, think about it. The economy in Africa, trading and everything is just, it becomes much, much easier. And so wealth is able to move around, and we're able to create new infrastructure, new industries that's really gonna grow. I mean, I'm excited about where we are. I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about where we are going into. And I think the foundation has been laid. And in the next few years, we're gonna see great progress.
Gentlemen, thank you, and we leave it there for today. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa, but you can follow this conversation on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And do join us again next week for another edition of the program. From Dakar in Senegal, goodbye.